Bexley moved with careful precision, her hands steady as she arranged the glasses for Ricardo's scheduled wine tasting. The golden light of late afternoon filtered through the tall windows of Montclair Estate's grand dining room, casting a warm glow over the polished oak table laden with rows of crystal wine glasses. The estate's latest vintage had just been bottled, and everything needed to be perfect. She took a deep breath, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face, and double-checked her work. The sound of Ricardo's measured footsteps echoed faintly down the marble hallway. Bexley's heart tightened, as it often did when her employer was near. She had worked at Montclair Estate for over 4 years, and though she prided herself on her professionalism, Ricardo's presence never failed to make her acutely aware of her surroundings and her feelings. He was everything the estate demanded, sharp, composed, and ever conscious of his family's reputation. But there was a gentleness beneath his steely exterior that she'd glimpsed on rare occasions, moments she cherished more than she dared admit. Lost in thought, Bexley reached for a final glass and miscalculated. Her elbow nudged the edge of a tray, sending it tipping forward. Time slowed as a cascade of crystal toppled from the table, shattering upon impact with the tiled floor. The sharp crash reverberated through the room, followed by a stunned silence. "Bexley!" Ricardo's voice called from just outside the door, firm but tinged with concern. She froze, heat flooding her cheeks. I'm fine," she stammered, kneeling quickly to gather the shards. Her hands trembled, her mortification growing with every moment. The door swung open and Ricardo entered, his tall frame silhouetted against the hallway's light. His dark eyes took in the scene, the broken glass, the scattering of wine droplets, and Bexley's flustered state. For a moment he said nothing, then stepped forward, crouching beside her. "You'll cut yourself," he said gently, his voice softening as he reached for a piece of cloth to shield her hands. Their fingers brushed briefly, and Bexley felt a jolt of awareness that she hoped didn't show on her face. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Montclair," she began, her words rushing out. "I wasn't paying attention and—" "Stop!" he interrupted, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "It's just glass. You're more important than a few broken cups." Bexley blinked, momentarily disarmed by his tone. Ricardo rose to his full height and offered her a hand, helping her to her feet. "Leave this to me," he said. "You've had a long day. Go to the study in 10 minutes. There's something I need to discuss with you." Bexley hesitated, glancing at the mess. "But I should—" "It's an order, Bexley," Ricardo said, his usual authority returning. His smile softened the command, but there was no mistaking the finality in his tone. As he bent to clean the shattered glass, Bexley slipped out of the room, her thoughts a whirlwind of embarrassment and curiosity. Ricardo had never spoken to her in that tone before, kind but firm, almost personal. And what could he possibly want to discuss with her? 10 minutes later, Bexley found herself standing before the heavy oak door of the study. She knocked hesitantly. "Come in," Ricardo's voice called. Taking a steadying breath, Bexley pushed the door open and stepped inside. Bexley stepped into the study, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug that stretched across the floor. The room was dimly lit, with the last rays of sunlight casting an amber glow through the tall windows. Ricardo stood behind the massive mahogany desk, his posture relaxed but his gaze intent as he looked up from a folder of papers. "Have a seat," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. Bexley obeyed, her hands fidgeting in her lap as she perched nervously on the edge of the leather chair. "Mr. Montclair," she began, her voice careful, "if this is about what happened earlier—" Ricardo raised a hand, cutting her off. "It's not about that," he said firmly, though there was a trace of amusement in his tone. "Accidents happen, Bexley. I have something far more important to discuss with you." Her heart skipped a beat. She couldn't imagine what could warrant this level of seriousness. Ricardo leaned forward slightly, clasping his hands on the desk. "As you know, my wedding to Remy is scheduled to take place in a month," he began, his voice measured. Bexley's stomach tightened at the mention of Remy, the fiancé whose arrival at the estate had disrupted the quiet rhythm of their lives. "Yes, sir," Bexley replied, keeping her tone neutral despite the pang in her chest. "What you may not know," Ricardo continued, "is that we've been struggling to find someone to manage the preparations. Remy's expectations are extensive, and none of the candidates we've interviewed have been able to meet them." Bexley blinked, confused. "I'm sorry to hear that, but I'm not sure how I can help." Ricardo leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "That's precisely what I want to discuss. Over the years, you've proven yourself to be not only competent, but exceptionally resourceful. I trust you, Bexley, more than anyone else on this estate. I want you to take charge of the wedding preparations." For a moment, Bexley thought she'd misheard. "Me?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "But I don't have experience with events of this scale. Surely there are professionals who—" "None of them know this estate or its staff as well as you do," Ricardo interrupted, his tone firm, but not unkind. "You've handled every challenge I've thrown at you with grace and efficiency. I have no doubt you're capable of this." Bexley felt her cheeks flush under his steady gaze. She opened her mouth to protest again, but the sincerity in his expression silenced her. This wasn't just an assignment, it was a gesture of trust, one that carried weight she couldn't ignore. Before she could form a coherent response, Ricardo continued, his voice softening. "I won't deny that this task is beyond your usual responsibilities, but I'll make sure you're compensated accordingly. More importantly, I need someone I can rely on to ensure everything runs smoothly, for Remy's sake and for the estate's." The mention of Remy brought Bexley back to reality. The idea of pouring her energy into organizing a wedding that celebrated Ricardo's love for another woman was almost too much to bear. But how could she refuse? He had given her a chance to prove herself, trusted her with a task no one else could handle. Bexley hesitated, her voice faltering. She looked down at her hands, wrestling with her emotions. Finally, she nodded. "If you believe I'm the right person for this, I'll do my best not to let you down." A flicker of relief crossed Ricardo's face, and he smiled faintly. "I knew I could count on you," he said. Before either of them could say more, the door to the study swung open abruptly. Remy entered, her figure poised and commanding. Her eyes swept the room, landing on Bexley with a flicker of disdain before she turned her attention to Ricardo. "Darling, I hope I'm not interrupting," she said smoothly, though her tone suggested she didn't particularly care. "I came to discuss the floral arrangements. They're completely unacceptable." Ricardo's expression tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Remy, we're in the middle of something. Can it wait?" Her gaze shifted back to Bexley, her smile cold. "Oh, I didn't realize you were busy with staff." The pointed remark sent a fresh wave of discomfort through Bexley, but she kept her composure, standing quickly. "I should go," she murmured. "Stay," Ricardo said sharply, his eyes narrowing slightly as he turned to Remy. "Bexley is going to be managing the wedding preparations. I was just informing her of the new arrangement." Remy's smile froze, her eyes narrowing. "The housekeeper? Alex, you can't be serious. Surely you don't expect—" "I trust her," Ricardo said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She's more than capable." The tension in the room was palpable. Bexley could feel Remy's icy glare, but avoided meeting her eyes. Gathering her courage, she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Montclair. I'll begin planning immediately." With that, she excused herself, stepping out of the study and into the quiet corridor. Her heart pounded in her chest as she leaned against the wall, exhaling shakily. This was the most daunting challenge she had ever faced, but it was also an opportunity to prove herself. And yet, as she walked away, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that her involvement in this wedding would change everything, for better or worse. The sun was just beginning to rise over Montclair Estate, casting a pale golden hue across the sprawling vineyards. Bexley stood at the edge of the garden, clipboard in hand, trying to suppress the swirl of anxiety in her chest. The first task on her list was meeting with the vendors to finalize details for Remy's wedding. Though the responsibility weighed heavily, she reminded herself that Ricardo trusted her, and she refused to let him down. "Bexley!" Natasha's cheerful voice broke through her thoughts. Turning, Bexley saw her friend approaching, a basket of freshly picked grapes in hand. Natasha's presence was always a source of comfort, her easy humor and candid advice making even the tensest situations feel manageable. "You're up early," Natasha remarked, setting the basket down. "I figured you'd still be recovering from yesterday. The great Remy Bancroft doesn't exactly make life easy, does she?" Bexley managed a weak smile. "I don't think easy is in her vocabulary. I'm supposed to meet the florist this morning to discuss the arrangements she rejected." She glanced at her clipboard. "And then there's the caterer, the band, the seating chart." Natasha gave a low whistle. "Sounds like you've got your hands full. Are you sure you're up for this?" "I don't have a choice," Bexley replied, her tone resolute. "Ricardo is counting on me." Natasha's teasing expression softened. "You know, he's not the only one who thinks you're amazing at what you do. You've got this, Bex. And if anyone gives you trouble, send them my way. I can intimidate with the best of them." Bexley laughed despite herself, grateful for Natasha's unwavering support. "I might just take you up on that." As Natasha headed back toward the vineyards, Bexley squared her shoulders and turned toward the estate. The day ahead was daunting, but she was determined to tackle it one step at a time. Her resolve was tested almost immediately upon reaching the conservatory, where the florist and her team were waiting. The tension in the room was palpable as Remy stood near the center, her arms crossed and her expression one of thinly veiled irritation. "These colors are completely wrong," Remy declared as Bexley entered. She gestured to the arrangements of pale pink roses and white lilies. "I told you I wanted a modern aesthetic. This looks like something out of a Jane Austen novel." Bexley took a steadying breath and approached the florist. "Thank you for bringing these samples. Could we explore some alternative options in the color palette Miss Bancroft mentioned, perhaps something with more contrast?" The florist nodded, clearly relieved that Bexley had stepped in. As the team began adjusting the arrangements, Bexley turned to Remy. "I'll ensure that everything aligns with your vision. Would you like to review some additional sketches to refine the details?" Remy's eyes narrowed slightly, as though searching for a flaw in Bexley's approach. "I suppose that would be acceptable," she said finally, though her tone remained clipped. The exchange left Bexley's nerves frayed, but she maintained her composure. This was only the first of many battles she would face that day. As the morning wore on, Bexley moved swiftly from one meeting to the next. After resolving the florist's dilemma, she coordinated with the catering team in the estate's kitchen. The head chef, a meticulous man named Pierre, was already in a heated debate with one of his sous chefs over the menu Remy had dictated. "It's absurd," Pierre declared, gesturing dramatically with his whisk. "She wants a 7-course meal featuring dishes from 5 different cuisines. Do I look like I have 10 arms and a time machine?" Bexley approached with a calming smile. "Pierre, I understand her requests are ambitious. Let's focus on the core elements and see where we can find balance." Pierre sighed but nodded. "Fine. But if she demands sushi and soufflés in the same course, I'm walking. Bexley chuckled softly. Noted. As she jotted down adjustments to the menu, the sound of heels clicking against the tile announced Remy's arrival. The room seemed to freeze as she entered, her sharp gaze sweeping over the bustling kitchen. Bexley straightened, readying herself for another potential confrontation. "Have you resolved the menu issues?" Remy asked, her tone curt. "Yes, Miss Bancroft," Bexley replied evenly. "Pierre and I have discussed the logistics. We've streamlined the menu to ensure it meets your expectations while remaining feasible." Remy raised a skeptical eyebrow. "I certainly hope so. The Montclair wedding must set a new standard, not fall into mediocrity." Before Bexley could respond, Pierre stepped forward, clearly biting back a retort. "It will be perfect, Miss Bancroft, I assure you." Satisfied, Remy gave a small nod before turning her attention back to Bexley. "And the seating chart? Have you finalized it yet? I need to ensure the Hawthorne delegation isn't seated anywhere near the Saint. Claire's. They've been feuding for years and I won't have their drama overshadowing my event." "I'll adjust it immediately," Bexley replied, keeping her voice steady. She waited until Remy swept out of the kitchen before exhaling a quiet sigh of relief. "Does she ever smile?" Pierre muttered, shaking his head. Bexley managed a faint smile. "Rarely." The afternoon was no less demanding. As Bexley worked through the seating arrangements in the estate's study, Natasha appeared, leaning casually against the doorframe. "You look like you've been through a war," she teased. "Feels like it," Bexley admitted, rubbing her temples. "Remy is relentless." "She's not the only one," Natasha said with a smirk. "Ricardo's been pacing around the vineyard all day, mumbling to himself. Something's eating at him." Bexley paused, her pen hovering over the chart. "He's probably just stressed about the wedding." "Maybe," Natasha replied, though her tone suggested she didn't fully believe it. "Or maybe it's something else. He keeps asking about you, you know." Bexley's cheeks warmed, but she quickly dismissed the thought. "I'm just the housekeeper managing his fiancée's wedding. There's nothing more to it." Natasha gave her a knowing look, but didn't press further. "Well, if you need backup, you know where to find me." As Natasha left, Bexley's thoughts drifted to Ricardo. Despite Remy's constant demands and the seemingly insurmountable challenges, it was his trust that kept her going. But trust, she knew, came with its own weight. She couldn't afford to fail, not for herself, and certainly not for him. By evening the estate had quieted, though Bexley's mind raced with the day's events. She stood on the terrace overlooking the vineyard, the cool breeze offering a brief reprieve. In the distance, Ricardo walked among the rows of grapevines, his silhouette outlined against the fading sun. For a moment Bexley allowed herself to wonder. What was he thinking about out there, pacing beneath the golden sky? And why, despite everything, did she feel like the answers mattered so much? The day's work was far from over, but as she turned back toward the estate, Bexley resolved to meet every challenge head-on. Little did she know, the battles ahead would test her in ways she never imagined, forcing her to confront not only Remy's wrath, but the emotions she'd kept buried deep within herself. The vineyard was alive with the hum of activity as workers tended to the ripe clusters of grapes hanging heavy on the vines. Ricardo stood at the edge of the vineyard, his gaze fixed on the horizon, though his mind was far from the scenic beauty surrounding him. For the first time in weeks, the pressure of the wedding and its endless preparations felt almost unbearable. "Lost in thought, are we?" Natasha's voice cut through the stillness as she approached, wiping her hands on a cloth. She'd been overseeing the harvest all morning, but had clearly taken notice of Ricardo's brooding. Ricardo turned slightly, offering her a faint smile. "I suppose you could say that." Natasha studied him for a moment before crossing her arms. "This isn't about the wedding menu or the seating chart, is it?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's everything, Natasha. The wedding, the estate, my father's legacy. Remy. It's all becoming too much. Natasha raised an eyebrow, her tone light but probing. Funny, I don't hear Bexley's name in that list. She seems to be the one keeping everything together for you right now. Ricardo's jaw tightened, and he looked away. Bexley has been incredible. I don't know what I would have done without her these past few weeks. Yet here you are, pacing through the vineyard like a man with a guilty conscience, Natasha said, her sharp gaze unrelenting. Ricardo chuckled bitterly. Perhaps I do have one. Marrying Remy. It made sense once. It was what everyone expected of me. But now... He trailed off, his thoughts unspoken but painfully clear. Natasha's expression softened. You've always put Montclair Estate first, Ricardo. Your family, your responsibilities. But have you ever stopped to think about what you actually want? His silence was answer enough. Natasha stepped closer, her tone turning serious. You've been chasing what others think is right for years. Maybe it's time to stop running and start choosing. Before Ricardo could respond, the sound of voices drifted toward them from the direction of the estate. Both turned to see Remy walking briskly toward the vineyard, her heels sinking slightly into the soft earth. "Darling!" she called, waving a perfectly manicured hand. "There you are. I've been looking everywhere for you. We need to talk about the guest list. It's an absolute disaster." Natasha smirked, stepping back. "Looks like that's my cue to leave. Good luck, Ricardo." As Natasha walked away, Ricardo steeled himself. "What's the issue now, Remy?" he asked, keeping his tone measured. Remy huffed as she reached him, clearly exasperated. "Bexley has been tinkering with the seating chart again. She doesn't seem to understand that certain people cannot sit next to each other, and she's insisting we cut some of the guests due to space limitations. Space limitations. It's ridiculous." Ricardo frowned. "Bexley is only trying to ensure the event goes smoothly. Have you considered that she might be right?" Remy's eyes narrowed. "Right? About cutting guests from the most important event this estate has ever hosted? I don't think so. Perhaps she's overstepping her boundaries, Ricardo. You should remind her of her place." Ricardo's patience was wearing thin, but he held his ground. "Her place," he repeated, his voice cold. "Bexley is the reason this wedding hasn't collapsed under its own weight. If anyone deserves respect around here, it's her." Remy's expression darkened, but she forced a tight smile. "Of course, darling. I'll leave it to you to handle. Just ensure she knows who's in charge." As she turned and walked back toward the estate, Ricardo let out a long breath, frustration simmering beneath the surface. Ricardo remained in the vineyard for several moments after Remy's departure, his thoughts clouded with doubt and frustration. The tension in his life seemed to center on two very different women, one who made every moment heavier, and another who quietly carried burdens that weren't hers to bear. The contrast was stark, and with each passing day, harder to ignore. By the time he returned to the estate, the sun was high in the sky, casting sharp shadows along the grand hallways. He passed through the conservatory, where Bexley was engaged in a discussion with one of the estate's house staff. She was gesturing toward a long list of tasks, her tone calm but firm as she coordinated the day's logistics. Ricardo hesitated in the doorway, unnoticed. Watching her work, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of admiration. Where Remy demanded attention and control, Bexley inspired quiet confidence. She didn't bark orders, she solved problems. In this moment, Ricardo felt the full weight of his earlier conversation with Natasha. What did he want? "Mr. Montclair," Bexley said suddenly, turning and catching sight of him. She straightened, her clipboard held neatly in front of her. "Is everything all right?" He cleared his throat, stepping fully into the room. "I wanted to check on how things are progressing. It seems like you're managing well. Bexley nodded. We're on track, though there are a few details I need to finalize with the florist and caterer this afternoon, and I still need approval on the revised seating chart. At the mention of the seating chart, Ricardo's lips curved into a slight smile. Let me guess. Remy had a strong opinion about it. Bexley hesitated, then offered a diplomatic response. She was clear about her preferences. Yes, I've made adjustments where possible. He admired her restraint. You don't have to sugarcoat it, Bexley. I know she can be demanding. I prefer to think of it as a challenge, she replied, her tone light. But there was a flicker of something in her eyes, weariness perhaps, that didn't escape his notice. You've taken on more than your share of challenges recently, Ricardo said, his voice softening. And I know I haven't made it easier by asking so much of you. You trusted me with this, Bexley said simply. That means something to me. Her words struck something deep within him, and for a moment, Ricardo felt an urge to say more, to express the growing doubts about his decisions and the growing admiration he held for her. But the sound of footsteps approaching cut the moment short. Natasha appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable as she glanced between the two. Am I interrupting something? She asked, a teasing edge to her voice. Not at all, Bexley replied quickly, stepping back slightly. I was just updating Mr. Montclair on the preparations. Perfect timing, Natasha said, stepping into the room. Ricardo, can I steal you for a moment? There's something we need to discuss about the harvest schedule. Ricardo nodded, though he felt a pang of reluctance. Of course. Let's go. As Natasha led him away, she shot him a sidelong glance. You're playing a dangerous game, my friend, she murmured once they were out of earshot. Ricardo frowned. What do you mean? I mean, Natasha said pointedly, you might want to figure out what you really want before someone else makes the decision for you. Her words lingered long after their conversation ended, adding another layer to Ricardo's growing turmoil. As he walked through the estate later that evening, he knew one thing for certain. Something had to change, and soon. Meanwhile, Bexley, left alone in the conservatory, stared at her clipboard, her mind far from the tasks at hand. The tension between herself, Ricardo, and Remy was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. And though she tried to convince herself otherwise, she couldn't deny the faint glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, Ricardo felt the same conflict she did. The decisions they each faced in the coming days would shape not just the wedding, but the lives of everyone at Montclair Estate. The tension was rising, and the consequences would soon become impossible to avoid. The afternoon sun bathed the Montclair Estate in a golden glow, casting long shadows across the manicured gardens. Inside the grand hall, Bexley stood at the base of the sweeping staircase, clipboard in hand, going over the next set of tasks for the day. Her brow furrowed slightly as she mentally sorted through the ever-growing list of wedding preparations. Just as she was about to move on, Ricardo's voice called out from behind her. Bexley, wait! She turned, startled. He was descending the staircase, his pace unhurried, but his gaze fixed intently on her. Mr. Montclair, she began, her tone formal. Is there something you need? He hesitated, his hand brushing lightly against the banister as he reached the bottom step. Actually, yes. I wanted to see if you'd join me for a walk. There's something I'd like to discuss. Bexley blinked, caught off guard by the unusual request. Of course, she said finally, setting her clipboard on a nearby table. They stepped out onto the terrace, the crisp scent of the vineyard filling the air as Ricardo led the way down a path lined with blooming rose bushes. For a while, neither of them spoke, the soft crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound. Eventually, Ricardo broke the silence. I've been thinking about everything you've done for this wedding, for the estate. It's more than anyone could have asked for. Bexley glanced at him, unsure of how to respond. It's my job, she said softly. I'm here to help. It's more than just a job to you, though, isn't it? He asked, his tone laced with curiosity. You care about this place, about the people here. She paused, considering his words. I do, she admitted. Montclair has been my home for years, and I suppose it feels like family in its own way. Ricardo nodded, his expression unreadable. That's exactly what I've been struggling with. This estate, it's not just a property or a business. It's part of who I am, and yet I feel like I'm losing sight of what really matters. Bexley stopped walking, turning to face him. What do you mean? He hesitated, as though weighing his next words carefully. This wedding, my relationship with Remy, everything about it feels like I'm following a script someone else wrote. And the more I think about it, the more I realize it's not what I want. Her breath caught, the weight of his confession settling between them. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could find the words, a voice rang out from behind them. There you are, Ricardo. They both turned to see Remy approaching, her posture impeccable, her expression calm but calculating. I've been looking for you everywhere, she said, her gaze flicking briefly to Bexley before settling on Ricardo. We need to finalize the plans for the ceremony. Time is running out. Ricardo's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Of course. I'll meet you in the study in a few minutes. Remy lingered for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked at Bexley. Don't let me interrupt, she said smoothly, though the edge in her voice was unmistakable. As she walked away, Bexley turned back to Ricardo, her heart pounding. I should go, she said quickly, taking a step back. No, Ricardo said firmly, his tone stopping her in her tracks. We're not finished. Bexley froze, uncertain how to respond. Ricardo's words hung in the air, weighted with an intensity she hadn't anticipated. She hesitated, glancing in the direction Remy had gone, but his gaze drew her back. Ricardo, she began softly, but he interrupted her. Please, he said, his voice steady but low. Just give me a moment. She nodded, staying rooted in place as he stepped closer. His expression softened, the frustration and conflict that had clouded his features moments ago giving way to something more vulnerable. I know this is unfair, Ricardo admitted, running a hand through his hair. You've done nothing but dedicate yourself to this estate and this wedding, and here I am questioning everything about it, about my choices. Bexley's breath hitched, but she kept her voice calm. It's not wrong to question things, she said gently, especially when it comes to something as important as your future. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers. You've always been honest with me, Bexley. Tell me, do you think I'm making a mistake? The question stunned her. She opened her mouth to reply, but found herself at a loss for words. How could she answer that without revealing the feelings she had buried for so long? How could she stay impartial when the thought of him marrying Remy was a pain she couldn't bear? I think, she began carefully, that only you can answer that question. But whatever you decide, it should be for the right reasons, not because of expectations or pressure, but because it's what you truly want. Ricardo nodded slowly, her words seeming to resonate with him. You're right, he said after a pause. It's just difficult to know what that is anymore. Bexley wanted to comfort him, to tell him that he didn't have to carry the weight of the world alone. But before she could say anything more, the sound of hurried footsteps approached once again. Natasha appeared at the edge of the path, her expression a mixture of amusement and exasperation. There you are, she said, her voice breaking the tension. Bexley, I thought I'd find you here. We have a situation with the seating arrangements. Apparently someone decided they're too important to sit near the kitchen doors. Bexley let out a soft laugh, grateful for the distraction. Of course, I'll handle it. Natasha's gaze shifted to Ricardo, her brow arching slightly. And you, Mr. Montclair? Shouldn't you be finalizing those ceremony plans with your charming bride-to-be? Ricardo's lips pressed into a thin line, but he nodded. I suppose I should, he said, his tone unreadable. As Natasha led Bexley back toward the estate, she shot her a sidelong glance. What's going on with you two? She asked casually, though her eyes gleamed with curiosity. Nothing, Bexley replied too quickly. We were just talking. Natasha smirked but didn't press further. If you say so. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of activity, but Ricardo's words lingered in Bexley's mind. As she worked through the endless details of the wedding, a quiet resolve began to form within her. She couldn't control what Ricardo chose, but she could control how she faced whatever came next. Meanwhile, Ricardo sat in the study with Remy, listening as she rattled off her latest demands for the ceremony. But his mind was elsewhere, replaying his conversation with Bexley and the quiet certainty in her voice when she had told him to follow his own heart. It was a clarity he hadn't felt in weeks, and though he didn't have all the answers yet, one thing was becoming increasingly clear. Something had to change, and soon. Bexley hurried down the estate's west corridor, her heart racing as she clutched a small folder tightly against her chest. Inside were the contracts she'd come across that morning, documents that revealed a deal Remy had been orchestrating behind Ricardo's back. The implications were staggering. Remy had planned to sell a portion of Montclair estate to a private investor, a transaction that would strip Ricardo of a key part of his family's legacy. As she rounded the corner leading to the library, Natasha's voice stopped her. Bexley! She turned to see Natasha leaning casually against the doorframe of the adjacent sitting room, her arms crossed but her expression serious. Where are you off to in such a hurry? Natasha asked, her tone light but probing. I need to speak with Mr. Montclair, Bexley replied, trying to keep the urgency out of her voice. Natasha raised an eyebrow. And what's in the folder? Bexley hesitated. She trusted Natasha implicitly, but the weight of what she'd discovered made her cautious. Something he needs to see, she said finally. Natasha studied her for a moment before stepping closer. You look like you've seen a ghost. What's going on, Bexley? Unable to contain herself any longer, Bexley handed Natasha the folder. Take a look, she said softly. Natasha opened it and scanned the contents, her sharp eyes narrowing as she read. When she finished, she let out a low whistle. Well, this explains a lot, she muttered. She's been busy, hasn't she? She's been manipulating him, Bexley said, her voice trembling slightly. This deal, it's not just about money. It's about control. If this goes through, Ricardo won't just lose part of the estate. He'll lose the trust of everyone who's ever believed in him. Natasha nodded, closing the folder and handing it back. You're right. He needs to know. But are you sure you want to be the one to tell him? This could get messy, Bex. Bexley straightened her shoulders, her resolve hardening. He deserves the truth, no matter how messy it is. Natasha gave her a small, encouraging smile. Then go. I'll cover for you if Remy starts looking for him. With a nod of gratitude, Bexley turned and continued toward the library. Her nerves threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to stay focused. Ricardo needed to see the documents before it was too late. When she reached the library, she found him sitting by the window, a book in his lap. He looked up as she entered, his expression shifting from surprise to concern when he saw the folder in her hands. Bexley, he said, setting the book aside. What's going on? She crossed the room quickly and placed the folder on the table in front of him. You need to see this, she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Ricardo opened the folder and began to read. His eyes darkened as he took in the details, his jaw tightening with each passing second. When he finally closed the folder, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. "How long have you known about this?" he asked, his tone controlled but edged with anger. "I found it this morning," Bexley said, clasping her hands in front of her. "I came straight to you." Ricardo stood, pacing the room as he processed the revelation. "She's been planning this behind my back," he muttered, more to himself than to Bexley. "After everything I've done to protect this estate." Bexley hesitated before speaking. "Ricardo, you can stop this. The deal hasn't gone through yet." He stopped pacing and turned to her, his expression a mix of frustration and determination. "You're right," he said firmly. "But this changes everything." Ricardo turned back to the desk, his fingers drumming against the polished wood as his mind raced. The weight of Remy's betrayal settled heavily on him, and for a moment he seemed lost in thought. Bexley watched him carefully, unsure of whether to say more or give him space to process. "She's been manipulating me this entire time," Ricardo finally said, his voice low but steady. "I should have seen it, the way she's handled every decision about this wedding, about the estate. It was never about us. It was always about her." Bexley stepped closer, her hesitation melting away. "Ricardo, this isn't your fault. You trusted her, and she took advantage of that. But you still have the power to stop her." His eyes met hers, and for the first time since she'd entered the room, a flicker of gratitude crossed his face. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for bringing this to me, for being honest when so many others wouldn't have been." Before Bexley could respond, the library door swung open with a loud creak. Both of them turned to see Remy standing in the doorway, her gaze immediately locking onto the folder in Ricardo's hands. Her posture stiffened, and a cold smile spread across her lips. "Well, this is quite the little meeting," she said, her voice sharp and dripping with disdain. "I don't suppose you were discussing floral arrangements?" Ricardo's expression hardened. "Enough, Remy. I know about the deal. I know what you've been planning behind my back." Remy's smile faltered for a brief moment, but she quickly recovered, stepping further into the room. "Whatever you think you've found, I assure you, it's not what it looks like. It looks like you were preparing to sell part of my family's estate without my knowledge," Ricardo said, his voice rising. "You've been using this wedding as a cover to position yourself for control, haven't you?" Her composure cracked slightly, but she straightened her shoulders. "I was doing what needed to be done," she snapped. "You're so obsessed with preserving this outdated legacy that you can't see the bigger picture. That deal would have secured our future together." Ricardo shook his head, his disappointment evident. "This was never about us, Remy. It was about you, your ambitions, your control. I've spent months trying to convince myself that this marriage was right, but this proves I was wrong." Remy's eyes narrowed. "Be careful, Ricardo. You don't want to make a mistake you'll regret." "No," he said firmly, stepping closer to her. "The mistake was ever thinking we could build a life together. This wedding is off." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Remy's eyes widened, and for a moment she looked genuinely stunned. But then her expression hardened into one of icy resolve. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "I won't let you humiliate me like this, Ricardo." Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the library, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. The silence that followed was deafening. Bexley stood frozen, unsure of what to say or do. Ricardo turned to her, his shoulders slumping slightly as the adrenaline drained away. "I'm sorry you had to witness that," he said, his voice softer now. but I couldn't let her get away with this. You did the right thing, Bexley said gently, taking a cautious step closer. She would have destroyed everything you've worked for. Ricardo nodded, though his expression was tinged with sadness. I just wish I'd seen it sooner. Bexley hesitated before speaking again. What happens now? He took a deep breath, his gaze steadying as he looked at her. Now, I fix what's been broken, starting with the estate and with myself. As he spoke, a sense of clarity seemed to settle over him. For the first time in weeks, Ricardo felt as though he was taking back control of his own life. And though the road ahead was uncertain, he knew he wouldn't face it alone. The early morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the estate's dining room, casting soft golden light across the long table where Bexley sat. A steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands. The events of the previous day still weighed heavily on her mind. Ricardo's confrontation with Remy, the heated exchange, and the final resolute declaration that the wedding was off. It had been a whirlwind of emotions, and now, as the dust began to settle, Bexley found herself wondering what would come next. The sound of footsteps drew her attention, and she looked up to see Natasha entering the room. As always, Natasha's expression was a mix of curiosity and amusement, though there was a softness in her gaze that suggested she knew how much Bexley had been through. "You're up early," Natasha remarked, sliding into the chair across from her. "Couldn't sleep?" Bexley shook her head. "Not much, no, there's too much to think about." Natasha smirked. "I'd say you've earned a day off after everything that went down yesterday. But knowing you, I'm guessing that's not on the agenda." Bexley managed a small smile. "There's still so much to do. Cancelling the wedding isn't as simple as just saying the words. There are vendors to contact, arrangements to undo, and—" Natasha held up a hand, cutting her off. "Bex, stop. You've already done more than enough. Let Ricardo deal with the fallout for once. It's his mess to clean up." "I know," Bexley admitted, lowering her gaze, "but it feels wrong to just step back now. He trusted me to handle all of this." Natasha reached across the table, placing a hand on Bexley's. "He trusted you because you're the one person who always gets things done, but that doesn't mean you have to carry the whole estate on your shoulders. Let him take the lead for a change." Before Bexley could respond, the door to the dining room opened and Ricardo appeared. He looked tired, but there was a determination in his expression that hadn't been there the day before. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady as he joined them at the table. "I was hoping I'd find you both here." Natasha leaned back in her chair, raising an eyebrow. "And what brings you to the dining room at this hour, boss?" Ricardo's lips quirked into a faint smile. "I wanted to thank you both for everything." His gaze shifted to Bexley, lingering for a moment. "Yesterday was difficult, but it needed to happen, and I couldn't have gotten through it without your help." Bexley felt her cheeks warm under his scrutiny, but she quickly shook her head. "You didn't need my help, Ricardo. You made the decision on your own." "Maybe," he conceded, "but you gave me the clarity to see what I needed to do. For that, I'm grateful." Natasha cleared her throat, breaking the moment. "Well, it's good to see you're finally taking charge. So, what's the plan now?" Ricardo leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "The first priority is stabilizing the estate. The deal Remy was working on hasn't gone through yet, but we'll need to ensure it doesn't. I've already reached out to my legal team, but I'll need your help, Bexley, to go over the contracts and identify any other vulnerabilities." Bexley nodded. "Of course. Whatever you need." "And after that?" Natasha pressed. Ricardo hesitated, his gaze distant for a moment. "After that, we rebuild. Not just the estate, but the trust and the relationships that have been strained. It won't be easy, but it's the only way forward." Bexley and Natasha exchanged a glance before turning back to Ricardo, whose resolve was unmistakable. The man before them seemed different, less burdened by expectation and more determined to steer his life in a direction that felt truly his own. For a brief moment, Bexley allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something better, for him and for Montclair Estate. "All right," Natasha said, breaking the silence. "It sounds like you've got a plan, but if you're serious about rebuilding, you're going to need more than just legal contracts and trust exercises. You need to make a statement, Ricardo, something that shows everyone you're in control and that the estate is stronger than ever." Ricardo nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. I'll think on that. For now, I need to focus on getting through today." As he stood to leave, his gaze lingered on Bexley once more. "Can you meet me in the study later this morning? I'd like to go over the contracts together." "Of course," she replied, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. When Ricardo exited the room, Natasha leaned forward, a mischievous glint in her eye. "He's looking at you differently, you know." Bexley shot her a warning look. "Natasha, don't start." "I'm just saying," Natasha continued with a shrug. "He's not exactly subtle. And let's be honest, it's about time he realized what's been right in front of him." Bexley sighed, standing to clear the table. "This isn't the time for speculation. Ricardo has enough on his plate without adding personal drama to the mix." Natasha smirked but didn't push further. "Whatever you say, Bex." The morning passed in a blur of activity as Bexley reviewed documents, communicated with vendors to officially cancel the wedding, and coordinated with the estate staff to dismantle the elaborate decorations that had been installed over the past few weeks. The grand ballroom, once bustling with anticipation, now felt eerily quiet as workers removed floral arrangements and folded away rows of elegant chairs. When Bexley finally arrived at the study, she found Ricardo already seated at the desk, a stack of papers spread out before him. He looked up as she entered, offering a small, tired smile. "Thanks for coming," he said. "I've been trying to make sense of all this, but I need a fresh pair of eyes." Bexley settled into the chair opposite him, her focus immediately drawn to the documents. Together they worked through the contracts, Ricardo pointing out clauses and terms while Bexley took meticulous notes. Their conversation was professional, but there was an ease between them that hadn't been there before, a shared understanding born of the trials they had faced together. After hours of collaboration, they reached the final page. Ricardo leaned back in his chair, exhaling a deep breath. "I think we've covered everything, for now at least." "You've made a lot of progress," Bexley said, offering him an encouraging smile. "The estate is lucky to have someone like you fighting for it." Ricardo studied her for a moment, his expression softening. "The estate is lucky to have someone like you, Bexley. I don't say it enough, but I mean it." Her cheeks warmed, but before she could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. One of the estate staff poked their head in, announcing that the attorney Ricardo had summoned had arrived. "I'll take care of this," Ricardo said, rising to his feet. "Thank you for everything today, Bexley. I'll keep you updated." As he left to meet with the attorney, Bexley gathered her things, her mind swirling with everything that had transpired. Despite the challenges that lay ahead, there was a quiet certainty growing within her, a sense that Montclair Estate and perhaps even Ricardo were on the path to something better. The estate buzzed with the kind of tension that came after a storm, but before the skies truly cleared. Although Remy had officially departed Montclair, the ripples of her actions lingered, casting a shadow over the staff and the estate itself. Word of the cancelled wedding spread quickly, and though many avoided speaking of it openly, whispers filled the halls. Bexley stood in the middle of the conservatory, clipboard in hand, overseeing the final dismantling of the wedding arrangements. She had spent the past 2 days coordinating the cleanup, ensuring every trace of the ill-fated event was removed without disrupting the estate's day-to-day operations. Yet, as the last of the floral arrangements were hauled out, a strange sense of finality settled over her. "It feels weird, doesn't it?" Natasha's voice broke through her thoughts. She appeared beside Bexley, hands in her pockets, and her usual air of casual confidence intact. "Like we're erasing history." Bexley offered a faint smile. "Maybe that's a good thing. Some history is better left behind." Natasha nodded, then tilted her head toward the doorway. "Speaking of history, Ricardo's been looking for you. He's in the vineyard, pacing around like a man with too much on his mind." Bexley hesitated. Since the confrontation with Remy, she and Ricardo had worked closely, but their conversations had remained strictly professional. She wasn't sure she was ready for anything more personal, though a part of her couldn't deny the curiosity and concern she felt for him. "Did he say why?" Bexley asked. Natasha shrugged. "Something about needing a second opinion. But between you and me, I think he just wants to talk. You should go." Taking a steadying breath, Bexley set her clipboard aside and made her way toward the vineyard. The late afternoon sun bathed the rows of grapevines in a warm, golden light, and she spotted Ricardo near the far edge, his hands tucked into his pockets as he paced. His usual air of composure seemed slightly frayed, and Bexley's heart ached at the sight. "Mr. Montclair?" she called softly as she approached. Ricardo turned, and his face softened when he saw her. "Bexley, I'm glad you came." "You were looking for me?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. "I was," he admitted, gesturing for her to walk with him. They strolled through the vineyard in silence for a few moments before he spoke again. "I wanted to get your thoughts on something." "Of course," Bexley said, though she couldn't hide the hint of curiosity in her voice. "What is it?" Ricardo stopped walking, turning to face her fully. The golden light framed his face, highlighting the weariness in his expression, but also a determination that hadn't been there before. "It's about the estate, about what happens next." Bexley tilted her head. "I thought the plan was to stabilize things, secure the estate, rebuild trust." "It is," Ricardo said, "but that's not enough. I don't want to just hold on to the past. I want to create something better, something that feels like it truly belongs to this generation." She studied him, her admiration growing as she listened. "That's a bold vision, but if anyone can make it happen, it's you." Ricardo smiled faintly at her words, though there was a vulnerability in his eyes that made Bexley's heart ache. "I appreciate your faith in me," he said quietly, "but this isn't something I can do alone. The estate's legacy was built on the strength of the people who cared for it, who believed in it. I need that now more than ever." "You've got the staff behind you," Bexley replied. "And Natasha, Clara, they'd do anything to support you. You're not alone in this." He nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on her. "I know, but there's one person whose perspective I value more than anyone else's. Someone who has shown me what it means to truly care for this place, and for the people who make it what it is." Bexley's breath caught as his meaning became clear. "Ricardo," she began, but he interrupted her, his voice soft but resolute. "Bexley, you've been the heart of this estate for as long as I can remember. You've done more than just your job. You've poured yourself into this place, into the people here, including me. I've leaned on you more than I probably should have, and yet you've never faltered." She felt her cheeks warm, her hands fidgeting nervously. "I just wanted to help, to do what I could." "You've done more than that," Ricardo said, stepping closer. "You've shown me what it means to truly care, and I need that care, that heart, if I'm going to rebuild this estate the way it deserves." Bexley looked up at him, her emotions swirling. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the weight of everything he'd been through, and the hope that was now shining through. But she also felt the enormity of what he was asking, not just professionally, but personally. "You've always had my support, Ricardo," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "And you always will. But I need to know. What does this mean to you? What do you really want?" He hesitated for only a moment before answering, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "I want to move forward, not with Remy's plans, not with my father's shadow looming over me, but with something real, something honest, and I want you to be part of it." The vulnerability in his words made Bexley's chest tighten. She knew this was about more than the estate. It was about him, about them, about the unspoken connection that had grown between them over years of quiet understanding and shared effort. Before she could respond, a shout from the direction of the main house broke the moment. One of the estate staff was waving frantically, calling Ricardo's name. "I'll be right there," he called back, his tone sharp with urgency. He turned back to Bexley, his expression apologetic but firm. "This isn't over. We'll finish this conversation." She nodded, watching as he hurried back toward the house. As the vineyard fell silent once more, Bexley stood alone among the vines, her heart racing and her mind spinning with possibilities. The words he had spoken stayed with her, echoing in the stillness. The future of Montclair Estate, and perhaps her own, had never felt more uncertain or more full of promise. The estate was alive with activity as staff, and workers moved quickly to address the latest emergency. Bexley followed the commotion back to the main house, her pulse quickening as she tried to piece together what had happened. She spotted Natasha near the grand staircase, her expression tense as she issued instructions to a group of workers. "Natasha, what's going on?" Bexley asked, hurrying over. Natasha turned, relief flashing across her face when she saw her. "We've got a situation," she said, motioning toward the eastern wing. "One of the pipes burst in the guest quarters. It's flooding, and we're trying to stop the damage before it spreads." Bexley's heart sank. The eastern wing was one of the most ornate parts of the estate, filled with irreplaceable antiques and delicate furnishings. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough," Natasha replied grimly. "Ricardo's already down there with the maintenance crew, but they're stretched thin." "I'll head there now," Bexley said without hesitation. She made her way to the eastern wing, where the sound of rushing water grew louder with each step. Turning a corner, she found Ricardo standing knee-deep in water, his sleeves rolled up as he worked alongside the crew to move furniture and salvage what they could. His determination was palpable, even in the face of chaos. "Bexley," he called out when he saw her, his voice cutting through the noise. "I could use an extra pair of hands." Without a second thought, she waded into the fray, helping him lift a heavy wooden table out of the water. Despite the urgency of the situation, there was a strange sense of camaraderie between them. They worked together seamlessly, barely needing to exchange words as they moved from one task to the next. After what felt like hours, the maintenance crew finally managed to shut off the water. The flooding was contained, but the damage was evident. The once pristine floors were soaked, and several pieces of furniture had been ruined. Ricardo stood in the middle of the room, surveying the scene with a weary expression. "Thank you for stepping in," he said to Bexley as she approached. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You don't have to thank me," she replied, brushing a damp strand of hair from her face. "This is my home too, in a way. I'll always do what I can to protect it." He smiled at her, the warmth in his eyes cutting through the exhaustion. "You've got a way of making everything seem manageable, even in the middle of a disaster." Bexley's cheeks warmed, but before she could respond, Natasha appeared in the doorway, a clipboard in hand. "We've got a damage report ready for you, Ricardo," she said. It's not pretty, but it could have been worse. Ricardo nodded, his focus shifting back to the task at hand. Let's take a look. As Natasha handed him the report, Bexley lingered for a moment, her gaze drifting around the damaged room. This place meant so much to Ricardo, and seeing it in this state made her resolve to help him rebuild even stronger. As the chaos subsided, Bexley found herself in the library later that evening, poring over the damage reports and outlining a plan to address the repairs. She had intended to rest after the long day, but her mind refused to settle. The estate wasn't just Ricardo's legacy. It had become a part of her life, a place she wanted to see thrive. The soft creak of the door pulled her from her thoughts. Ricardo stepped into the room, his shirt sleeves still rolled up and his hair slightly disheveled. He looked exhausted, but his expression softened when he saw her. "You're still working?" he asked, walking over to the desk where she sat. "I thought I'd get a head start on the repair plans," Bexley replied. "The faster we act, the less damage there'll be in the long run." Ricardo smiled faintly. "You never stop, do you?" "Neither do you," she countered, gesturing to his appearance. He chuckled, running a hand through his hair as he took the seat across from her. "Fair point. But you've done enough for one day. You should rest." Bexley hesitated, glancing at the papers spread before her. "I will," she said finally, "but there's something I wanted to ask you first." Ricardo tilted his head, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "What is it?" She took a steadying breath before speaking. "This estate means everything to you, I can see that. But after everything that's happened, with Remy, the cancelled wedding, and now the flooding, do you ever wonder if it's all worth it?" His expression grew serious as he leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the shelves of books that lined the room. "I've asked myself that question more times than I can count," he admitted. "There are days when it feels like a losing battle, like no matter how much I give, it's never enough." Bexley watched him closely, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. So why keep fighting for it? He turned back to her, and for a moment the weight of his emotions was laid bare. "Because it's more than just a piece of land or a collection of buildings. It's my family's history. It's the people who work here, who've dedicated their lives to making it what it is. And if I'm honest, it's the one thing in my life that's ever truly felt like home." His words hung in the air, and Bexley felt a lump rise in her throat. She knew exactly what he meant. Montclair Estate had become a home for her too, a place where she felt a sense of purpose she'd never found anywhere else. "Then it's worth fighting for," she said softly, "and you're not alone in that fight." Their eyes met, and Ricardo's expression shifted, a quiet gratitude shining through his fatigue. "I know," he said, his voice low, "and that makes all the difference." Before either of them could say more, a knock at the door interrupted them. Natasha poked her head in, her usual smirk softened by the weariness of the day. "Sorry to interrupt, but Clara just arrived. She said she needs to talk to both of you." Ricardo and Bexley exchanged a glance before rising from their seats. Together, they followed Natasha out of the library, a sense of anticipation growing with each step. Whatever Clara had to say, it was bound to mark the beginning of the next chapter in their efforts to rebuild, and perhaps even redefine, Montclair Estate. The sitting room felt unusually formal as Clara Montclair stood by the fireplace, her hands clasped in front of her. Her sharp eyes scanned the room as Ricardo, Bexley, and Natasha entered. Despite the late hour, Clara appeared composed, her presence commanding attention with ease. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "I've just returned from speaking with some of our family's long-standing associates. What I've learned concerns all of us." Ricardo moved to stand beside the armchair, his brow furrowed. What's going on, Clara? She gestured for everyone to sit, waiting until they were settled before continuing. The fallout from the cancelled wedding is larger than we anticipated. Remy's departure has sparked rumours, and certain individuals, former allies of the estate, are beginning to question its stability. Some have even suggested that we're no longer capable of maintaining Montclair's reputation. Ricardo's jaw tightened, and Bexley's heart sank. The estate's reputation had always been its strongest asset, a symbol of reliability and tradition in the region. Losing that trust could jeopardize not just their relationships with investors and clients, but the livelihoods of everyone who depended on the estate. "We can manage the repairs and the logistics," Ricardo said after a moment. "But controlling the narrative is another matter." Clara nodded. "Exactly. That's why we need to act quickly. We must demonstrate strength and transparency before these rumors take root. That means more than just fixing the damages. It means reminding people why Montclair Estate is worth believing in." Natasha leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "A public event could help. Something that shows the community we're still standing tall." "That's a good idea," Clara agreed. "But it has to be more than just a party. It needs to be meaningful. Something that ties Montclair back to its history and its future." Bexley hesitated, an idea forming in her mind. "What about a harvest festival?" she suggested. "Something that celebrates the estate's legacy in winemaking and its connection to the community." Clara's eyes brightened. "Now that's an idea. A festival could draw attention to the vineyard, bring people together, and rebuild trust all at once." Ricardo looked to Bexley, his expression softening as he considered her proposal. "It's ambitious," he said, "but it might be exactly what we need. Do you think we can pull it off?" Bexley straightened, determination rising within her. "If we work together, yes. We'll need everyone on board, but it's possible." "Then let's do it," Ricardo said, his tone firm. "Clara, reach out to our contacts and begin spreading the word. Natasha, I need you to coordinate the logistics with the vineyard staff. And Bexley—" He paused, meeting her gaze. "I want you to oversee the entire event. You've earned my trust 100 times over, and I can't think of anyone better to lead this." Bexley blinked, momentarily stunned by the weight of his words. But as his confidence in her sank in, she nodded. "I won't let you down." The next morning, the estate buzzed with renewed energy as preparations for the harvest festival began. Staff bustled through the halls, and the vineyard team worked tirelessly to ensure every detail of the event would reflect Montclair's storied reputation. Despite the overwhelming scope of the task, Bexley found herself invigorated by the challenge. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of hope, not just for the estate, but for everyone who called it home. Bexley stood in the courtyard, clipboard in hand, coordinating deliveries with Natasha. The two had fallen into a familiar rhythm, their banter light but focused. "Do you think we can actually pull this off in less than a week?" Natasha asked, glancing at the schedule. "We don't have a choice," Bexley replied with a small smile. "If anyone can make it happen, it's us." Natasha smirked. "You're right about that, but it's going to take some serious miracles to get those vintage barrels ready in time." "We'll make it work," Bexley said confidently, though the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her shoulders. As Natasha left to oversee the vineyard setup, Bexley turned her attention to the festival layout. She was mapping out the placement of booths and seating areas when Ricardo approached. "How's it going?" he asked, his tone warm but laced with concern. "We're on schedule," Bexley replied, glancing up at him. "Barely." Ricardo chuckled, the tension in his posture easing slightly. "You've got everything under control. I don't know how you do it." "Because I'm stubborn," she quipped, earning a rare laugh from him. For a moment they stood in companionable silence, the morning sun casting long shadows across the courtyard. Then Ricardo's expression grew more serious. "Bexley," he began, his voice quieter now. "About what I said yesterday, in the vineyard." Her heart skipped, the memory of his words rushing back. She kept her focus on the clipboard, though her fingers tightened around it. "You don't have to explain," she said quickly. "I understand." "No," Ricardo interrupted, stepping closer. "I need to say this. I've spent so much of my life making decisions based on what I thought was expected of me, what would protect the estate, what would honor my family. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what I actually wanted. And now, for the first time, I feel like I know." Bexley met his gaze, the sincerity in his eyes leaving her momentarily speechless. "Ricardo," she began, but before she could continue, Clara's voice rang out from the other side of the courtyard. "There you two are," she called, her tone brisk. "We've got an issue with the caterers. They're short-staffed and threatening to pull out unless we renegotiate their fee." Ricardo sighed, the moment broken, but he offered Bexley a small, apologetic smile. "Duty calls." "We'll figure it out," Bexley said, slipping back into her professional demeanor. As Clara led Ricardo away, Bexley watched him go, her emotions a tangled mess. The festival loomed large, and the pressure of the event left little room for personal reflection. Yet she couldn't ignore the undercurrent of change between them, a shift that felt as inevitable as it was terrifying. For now, though, she pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the work at hand. Montclair Estate needed her, and she was determined not to let it down. The courtyard buzzed with anticipation as the morning of the harvest festival dawned bright and clear. Tables adorned with rich autumn colors were arranged throughout the estate grounds, their surfaces lined with baskets of grapes, seasonal flowers, and handcrafted decorations. Vendors bustled to set up their booths, the scent of freshly baked bread and simmering cider wafting through the air. Bexley moved swiftly among the preparations, her clipboard in hand as she checked and double-checked every detail. Though she had barely slept in the days leading up to the festival, her energy was fueled by the determination to make the event a success. Montclair Estate's reputation depended on it, and she refused to let Ricardo, or anyone else, down. "Bex!" Natasha's voice rang out as she jogged over, her expression equal parts amused and exasperated. "The vineyard crew says the sound system for the main stage isn't working, and the caterers are threatening mutiny because they don't have enough serving trays." Bexley pinched the bridge of her nose, taking a steadying breath before responding. "All right, I'll talk to the caterers. Can you handle the sound system? See if the crew can reroute power from the main generator." "Consider it done," Natasha replied with a wink before darting off. As Bexley headed toward the catering tent, she caught sight of Ricardo standing near the entrance, speaking with a group of guests who had arrived early. He looked every bit the composed leader, his warm smile and confident demeanor putting the visitors at ease. Yet when his gaze met hers, there was a flicker of something deeper, gratitude perhaps, or reassurance. She quickly turned her focus back to the task at hand, intercepting the caterers before their frustrations could escalate further. After smoothing over the issue with a promise of additional supplies from the estate's storeroom, she made her way to the main stage, where Natasha was overseeing the sound system repair. "Any luck?" Bexley asked, joining her friend by the tangled mess of cables. Natasha grinned. "You're in luck. We've got a temporary fix in place. Might not be perfect, but it'll hold for now." "Good enough," Bexley said with a nod. "Let's just hope nothing else goes wrong." As the festival officially began, guests flooded the estate, their laughter and chatter filling the air. Booths showcasing the estate's wines, local crafts, and artisanal foods drew enthusiastic crowds, while the main stage hosted live performances from local musicians. The atmosphere was festive, a stark contrast to the tension that had gripped Montclair in recent weeks. Yet even as Bexley moved through the crowd, ensuring everything ran smoothly, a part of her remained on edge. The festival was a critical turning point for the estate, and while the day had started well, she knew the stakes were too high to relax just yet. As the afternoon wore on, the festival hit its stride. Guests moved from booth to booth, sampling Montclair's wines and purchasing goods from local artisans. The air was filled with laughter, the hum of conversation, and the lively melodies of a string quartet performing on the main stage. For the first time in weeks, the estate felt alive again, its vibrancy echoing its storied past. Bexley stood near the main stage, watching the scene unfold. A sense of pride welled up within her as she observed the joy on the faces of the guests. The festival was everything she'd hoped it would be, a celebration of Montclair Estate's legacy and a reminder of its place in the community. "You've outdone yourself," Ricardo's voice came from behind her. She turned to find him standing a few steps away, his expression warm but tinged with something deeper. "It wasn't just me," Bexley replied, gesturing to the bustling festival grounds. "It took everyone working together to make this happen." "Maybe," Ricardo said, stepping closer, "but none of this would have been possible without your leadership. You gave this place its heart back." Her cheeks warmed at the sincerity in his tone, and she quickly looked away, focusing on the crowd. "It's not over yet," she said, attempting to deflect. "We still have the evening events to get through." Ricardo chuckled softly. "You can allow yourself a moment to celebrate, you know." Before she could respond, Clara approached, her brisk steps and purposeful demeanor signaling something urgent. "Ricardo, Bexley," she said, her voice low. "We have a situation." Both of them straightened immediately. "What is it?" Ricardo asked. "There's been a problem with the wine shipment," Clara explained. "One of the delivery trucks was delayed, and the reserve stock we brought out is running low. If we don't address this quickly, we'll have some very unhappy guests." Ricardo's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Do we have any backup stock on site?" Clara nodded. "There's a small reserve in the cellar, but it's not enough to last the evening." "I'll handle it," Ricardo said, his tone decisive. He glanced at Bexley. "Can you keep things running here while I sort this out?" "Of course," she replied without hesitation. As Ricardo and Clara left to deal with the issue, Bexley turned her attention back to the festival. The setback was a reminder of how precarious their success was, but she refused to let it dampen the event. Rallying Natasha and the rest of the staff, she ensured that the guests remained entertained and the flow of wine continued seamlessly. When Ricardo returned an hour later, there was a quiet triumph in his expression. "Crisis averted," he said, joining Bexley near the stage. "We managed to secure an emergency shipment from a neighboring vineyard." "That's a relief," Bexley replied, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "The guests didn't even notice anything was wrong." Ricardo smiled at her, the weight of the day lifting slightly. "That's because you kept everything under control. Once again, you've saved the day." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the estate in hues of gold and crimson, the festival transitioned into its evening phase. Lanterns were lit, their warm glow illuminating the pathways, and the music shifted to a more intimate tone. Ricardo and Bexley stood together at the edge of the courtyard, watching as the guests gathered for the closing toast. "This is what Montclair is supposed to feel like," Ricardo said quietly, his gaze fixed on the crowd. "Alive, connected, meaningful." "It's what you've made it," Bexley replied, her voice just as soft. "And it's only the beginning." As the evening wore on, Ricardo raised his glass for the final toast, his words filled with gratitude and hope. Bexley stood by his side, a quiet but vital presence, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The days following the festival brought a renewed sense of purpose to Montclair Estate. The event had been an undeniable success, silencing the rumours that had plagued them and re-establishing the estate as a cornerstone of the community. Yet, for Ricardo and Bexley, the work was far from over. Bexley stood in the study, a stack of financial reports spread out before her on the desk. Despite the festival's positive reception, the estate's finances remained delicate. Repairs from the flooding, combined with the lingering costs of the cancelled wedding, left little room for error. "Lost in numbers again?" Natasha's teasing voice broke through her concentration as she stepped into the room. Bexley looked up with a faint smile. "You know me, always trying to make sense of the chaos." Natasha perched on the edge of the desk, glancing at the reports. "How bad is it?" "It's manageable," Bexley replied, though her tone was cautious. "But we'll need to tighten our budget and prioritize the most critical repairs." Natasha nodded, her expression turning serious. "Ricardo's been pushing himself harder than ever. He won't say it, but I think he's still carrying the weight of everything that happened with Remy." Bexley sighed, her gaze drifting to the window where the vineyard stretched out under the afternoon sun. "He's been through so much. I just wish there was more I could do to help." "You already do more than anyone else," Natasha said firmly, "but maybe it's time you reminded him that he doesn't have to do this alone." Before Bexley could respond, the door opened and Ricardo entered, his expression brightening slightly when he saw them. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, glancing between the two. "Not at all," Bexley said, gathering the reports into a neat pile. "I was just going over the numbers." Ricardo crossed the room, taking a seat across from her. "I've been meaning to talk to you about that. Clara mentioned you've been handling most of the planning for the repairs and the budget. I want you to know how much I appreciate everything you've done." Bexley shook her head. "It's nothing you need to thank me for. I just want to make sure the estate stays on track." "That's exactly why I need to thank you," Ricardo said, his tone earnest. "You've gone above and beyond, not just for the estate, but for me. I don't think I've ever properly acknowledged how much that means." His words left her momentarily speechless, the sincerity in his gaze stirring something deep within her. Before she could find the right response, Natasha cleared her throat, breaking the moment. "Well," Natasha said, standing, "I think that's my cue to leave. You two have things to discuss, and I have a vineyard to check on." She winked at Bexley before slipping out, leaving the two of them alone in the quiet study. As the door clicked shut behind Natasha, the silence in the room deepened, leaving Ricardo and Bexley alone with the unspoken weight of their conversation. Ricardo leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the desk as he studied her. "Bexley," he began, his voice soft but deliberate, "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the festival. About everything. The estate, the future, and you." Her breath caught, but she held his gaze, willing herself to stay composed. "What about me?" she asked carefully. Ricardo exhaled, his expression both serious and vulnerable. "You've been my anchor through all of this. When everything was falling apart, you held it together, not just for the estate, but for me. I don't think I realized until recently how much I've come to rely on you, and not just as a colleague." Bexley's heart pounded, the weight of his words sinking in. She opened her mouth to respond, but Ricardo continued before she could speak. "You've shown me what it means to truly care about something, or someone," he said, his voice dropping lower. "And I've realized that my vision for Montclair Estate, for my life, it doesn't feel complete without you." Her chest tightened, emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She hadn't allowed herself to hope for this, not after everything that had happened. Yet hearing him say it, the truth she had long buried within herself, surged to the surface. "Ricardo," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I don't even know what to say." He leaned back, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You don't have to say anything right now. I know this isn't something I can just spring on you after everything we've been through, but I needed to be honest, with you and with myself." Bexley nodded slowly, her mind racing. I appreciate your honesty, more than you know." Ricardo's gaze softened. "Take your time. Whatever you decide, know that I'll respect it." Before she could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. Clara stepped in, her expression brisk as always, but tinged with urgency. "Ricardo, Bexley," she said, glancing between them. "I hate to intrude, but we've just had word from one of the investors. They want to schedule a meeting to discuss the estate's long-term plans. It's an opportunity we can't afford to miss." Ricardo straightened, the moment between him and Bexley temporarily set aside. "I'll handle it," he said, rising to his feet. "Thank you, Clara." As Clara left, Ricardo turned back to Bexley, his expression resolute. "This conversation isn't over," he said softly. "But for now, we've got work to do." Bexley nodded, watching as he left the room. She sat alone for a moment, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. Ricardo's confession had changed everything, but as daunting as it was, it also felt like the beginning of something new, something she couldn't yet define, but couldn't bring herself to ignore. She stood, gathering the reports she'd been working on, and left the study with a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever the future held, she knew one thing for certain: Montclair Estate and the people who made it home was worth fighting for. The morning sun cast a warm glow over Montclair Estate as the final preparations for the intimate vineyard gathering began. The rows of grapevines were adorned with soft lanterns, their gentle light swaying in the cool breeze. Tables were set with elegant simplicity, reflecting the estate's timeless charm, and the scent of blooming flowers mingled with the rich aroma of wine. This was no grand affair, but that was precisely the point. It was a celebration of resilience, of new beginnings, and of home. Bexley stood near the edge of the vineyard, taking in the serene scene. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to breathe, to simply exist in the moment. The past months had been a whirlwind of challenges and changes, but today marked a turning point, not just for the estate, but for everyone who had been a part of its journey. "You've done it again," Natasha's voice came from behind her, filled with pride and teasing warmth. Bexley turned, smiling at her friend. "It wasn't just me. This was a team effort, as always." Natasha shrugged, her grin widening. "Maybe, but you're the one who keeps us all moving in the right direction. And don't even think about arguing with me. Just take the compliment." Laughing softly, Bexley relented. "All right, I'll take it this time." Natasha glanced toward the gathering crowd. "Looks like Ricardo's about to make his big speech. You better get over there. He's going to want you by his side." The mention of Ricardo sent a familiar flutter through Bexley's chest. Things between them had remained unspoken since their conversation in the study, but the connection they shared had only deepened in the days that followed. She wasn't sure what would come next, but for now she was content to let things unfold naturally. As she approached the center of the gathering, Ricardo stood by the head table, his presence commanding yet approachable. When he spotted Bexley, his expression softened, and he gestured for her to join him. Taking a steadying breath, she stepped forward, feeling the weight of the moment, but also the quiet joy it carried. Ricardo raised his glass, his voice carrying over the quiet murmurs of the crowd. "Tonight, we celebrate not just the harvest, but the spirit of Montclair Estate. This place has seen its challenges, but it has also shown us the power of perseverance, community, and care." The crowd quieted as Ricardo's words hung in the air, his sincerity resonating with everyone present. He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the familiar faces before settling on Bexley. This estate has always been more than land or vines or buildings, Ricardo continued. It's the people who make it what it is, their dedication, their resilience, and their heart. Tonight, I want to express my deepest gratitude to all of you who stood by Montclair through its trials, and to one person in particular who not only helped me see what this place could be, but reminded me of what truly matters. Bexley's cheeks flushed as she realized he was speaking about her. The warmth in his eyes was unmistakable, and the murmurs of approval from the crowd only added to the moment's weight. "Bexley," Ricardo said, his voice softer now but no less steady. "Your unwavering commitment has been the foundation of everything we've accomplished. This estate and I owe you more than words can express." A gentle round of applause rippled through the gathering, and Natasha winked at Bexley from the sidelines. Bexley smiled, her heart full as she nodded in acknowledgement, though she felt too overwhelmed to speak. As the gathering transitioned into a more relaxed celebration, Ricardo stepped away from the crowd and found Bexley near the edge of the vineyard. The golden glow of lanterns illuminated his face as he approached, his expression earnest. "You didn't have to say all that," Bexley said, her voice teasing but tinged with emotion. "I did," Ricardo replied, his tone firm but kind. "Because it's true, and because I need you to know how much you mean to me, not just to the estate, but to me personally." Her breath caught as his words settled over her. For a moment she searched his face, finding only honesty and warmth in his gaze. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then don't say anything," Ricardo said with a gentle smile. "Just know that whatever the future holds, I want us to face it together." Bexley felt a smile tug at her lips as she nodded, the unspoken understanding between them finally taking shape. As the celebration continued around them, the estate seemed to hum with the promise of new beginnings, not just for Montclair, but for the people who had brought it back to life. Together, they turned back toward the gathering, ready to step into the future, hand in hand.